Get on your knees." The words dropped into the middle of the Ashmore Grand's charity poker night, like a stone through glass. Sylvana Dare didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The event room had gone completely still the moment her champagne flute hit the floor. Not by accident. Everyone in the room silently understood, though no one would say so out loud. 57 people had witnessed what happened. 57 people now stood very still, with their drinks in their hands, their eyes aimed somewhere politely away from Nadine Quill. Nadine was already crouching, already gathering the scattered pieces of crystal from the marble floor with her bare hands, because she had learned a long time ago that the fastest way through a bad moment was to make herself useful and invisible at the same time. She was good at both, had spent the better part of 5 years perfecting it as the senior bookkeeper for Ashmore Enterprises, an organization whose charitable arm hosted nights like this one, and whose less charitable arm funded the kind of things that didn't appear on any balance sheet. She was a full-figured woman in a plain navy blazer, the kind that said, "I am here to work," and would prefer not to be discussed. She carried herself in a way that filled exactly the amount of space she needed, and no more. It was a discipline she had developed with some care. She knew the numbers behind every room in this building. She did not, as a rule, make herself the subject of anyone's attention. "I said on your knees," Sylvana repeated. Her voice was calm, almost bored. She was wearing a gown the color of ice and a diamond bracelet that cost more than Nadine's annual salary, and she stood with the particular posture of a woman who had never once been told no and did not intend to start tonight. "You knocked that glass from my hand in front of our guests. You will apologize properly." Nadine had not knocked the glass from her hand. She had been standing at the edge of the room, reviewing a discrepancy in the poker table tallies when Sylvana swept past her in a fury about something else entirely and clipped the tray a passing server was carrying. The glass had shattered. A few drops of champagne had landed on the sleeve of Senator Hollenbeck, who was seated at the nearest table. But Sylvana had turned to Nadine, and that had been that. "Miss Dare," Nadine said quietly, still crouching, still collecting broken glass, "why don't I get someone to bring a fresh drink for the senator, and we can?" "I didn't ask what you'd like to do." Sylvana's eyes were flat. "I asked you to apologize, to get on your knees and do it properly, in front of everyone you embarrassed." She glanced at the room, performing for an audience she had already decided was hers. "This is what accountability looks like." The room did not move. The sommelier near the bar took a small step backward. One of the event coordinators found something urgent to examine on his phone. Senator Hollenbeck looked at the tablecloth. Everyone understood the unspoken arithmetic. Sylvana Dare was 4 months from becoming Mrs. Corbett Ashmore. She was, in every practical sense, already the woman who owned this room. Nadine's hands were bleeding slightly from a shard she hadn't seen in time. She pressed her thumb to her palm and said nothing. She had learned that too. That silence was sometimes the only armor that didn't cost anything. Then the door at the far end of the room opened. The change was subtle at first. A shift in the air, a slight straightening in the posture of the 2 men nearest the entrance. Then a third man noticed and set down his glass. Then the senator looked up from the tablecloth. Then the sommelier stopped pretending to examine bottles he already knew by heart. By the time Corbett Ashmore had crossed 12 feet of marble floor, the entire room had rearranged itself around his presence, without anyone making a conscious decision to do so. He was not a large man exactly, not the kind that filled a room through sheer size. He was lean, somewhere in his early 40s, in a dark suit, with no tie and no visible insignia of anything. And he moved the way a person moved when they had never once in their adult life needed to hurry toward anything. His eyes, the particular grey of lake water before a storm, swept the room in less than 2 seconds. They landed on Nadine. still crouching. One hand braced on the floor, the other pressed to her palm. Crystal shards scattered around her on the marble. He did not look at Silvana yet. He walked to Nadine first. "Give me your hand." His voice was quiet. Not gentle, exactly, but precise in the way a very sharp instrument is precise. He crouched beside her without any concern for what it did to his trousers and looked at the cut on her thumb with the focused attention of a man who filed away details for later use. "It's fine," Nadine said. "You're bleeding on the Ashmore marble. I'll have it cleaned." "I'm not concerned about the marble." He produced a folded handkerchief from his jacket pocket, pressed it firmly to her palm, and stood. Then, and only then, he looked at Silvana. Silvana had arranged her expression into something composed and faintly puzzled, the way a person looks when they have been interrupted during a perfectly reasonable conversation. "Corbett," she smiled. "I didn't expect you until 9. Clearly, he held her gaze. What happened here? There was an accident. One of the staff was careless near the guests. She glanced at Nadine with a look of practiced patience. I was simply making sure it was handled appropriately, by asking her to kneel. Not a question. Several guests who had been trying to look elsewhere suddenly found they couldn't. Silvana's smile held. A formal apology in front of the people she inconvenienced isn't unreasonable. Ashmore regarded her for a moment. His expression didn't change. He turned to the 2 men who had come in behind him. "Get someone to clean this up." Then to Nadine, "Come with me." Nadine stood, still pressing the handkerchief to her palm, and followed him through the side door toward the service corridor. She was aware of every eye in the room tracking her exit. She kept her own eyes straight ahead, and her spine as straight as she could manage, because Nadine Quill had spent a long time deciding that she would not let anyone see her fold, no matter what it cost. In the corridor, Ashmore stopped and turned to face her. "Show me." She unwrapped the handkerchief. The cut was shallow, already slowing. He examined it the way he examined everything, quickly, completely. "There's a first aid kit in the manager's office. Rupert will take you." As if summoned, the older man who served as Ashmore's consigliere appeared from somewhere further down the hall. Rupert Haynes was 63, white-haired, and had the particular stillness of a man who had spent 4 decades watching other people make decisions and understanding, down to the marrow of his bones, exactly which ones mattered. "Of course," Rupert said. He looked at Nadine with the careful warmth of someone who did not offer it carelessly. "This way, Miss Quill." Nadine stopped. The quarterly variance reports for tables 6 through 9 need to be reconciled before the night closes. There's a discrepancy in the chip count from earlier, and if I don't— Ashmore cut her off, not unkindly. "The numbers will still be wrong in 20 minutes. They actually won't be. If the server rotation data refreshes at 10:15, the window to cross-reference the— Rupert." He looked at his consigliere. "Make sure she has access to whatever she needs from the office system while the cut is being treated." A beat of quiet surprise crossed Rupert's face, smoothed away quickly. Understood. The manager's office smelled like leather and stale coffee, which Nadine found oddly steadying. While Rupert located antiseptic and gauze with the efficiency of a man who had patched up considerably worse in considerably worse circumstances, she sat at the manager's terminal and worked. The discrepancy sorted itself out in 11 minutes. A data entry error on table 8, exactly where she had suspected. She flagged it, sent the corrected report, and was taping the last piece of gauze to her thumb when a young server appeared in the doorway. The girl couldn't have been older than 20. Her face was red, her eyes wet, and she was trembling in the particular way people trembled when they had been holding themselves together too long. "Mrs. Quill," her voice cracked, "I have to tell you something." Nadine looked up. The glass. The one that broke. The server pressed her hands together. It was my tray. I was carrying it across the room, and Miss Dare walked right into me. She wasn't watching where she was going, and she hit my tray, and the glass fell, and then she looked at me, and the girl's breath caught. I panicked. I thought she was going to fire me on the spot, and then she turned to you instead, and I just stood there and let her. And I'm so sorry, I'm so... Hey, Nadine's voice was firm but not unkind. Stop. The girl stopped. Look at me. Nadine waited until the server made eye contact. You're new here. 6 weeks. 6 weeks. And you were scared. That's not a character flaw. That's a Tuesday. She held the girl's gaze. But the next time, something like this ground, not because it's easy, because silence has a price tag, and sooner or later you're the one paying it. The server wiped her eyes. I should have said something tonight. You're saying it now. Nadine stood and smoothed the front of her blazer. That still counts. She paused. What's your name? Lords. Lords. When you carry a tray through a crowded room, keep your elbows out. 2 inches. It gives you warning when someone's coming close. A small smile. Less exciting than a public apology, more effective. The server actually laughed a little, through her tears. Rupert had been standing in the doorway for the last 30 seconds. He said nothing, but something in his expression had shifted, the way the light changes before weather moves in. By the time Ashmore retreated to the private office on the 4th floor, it was nearly midnight. He sat at the desk without turning on more than 1 lamp and let the quiet settle around him. Rupert arrived 12 minutes later with 2 glasses of whiskey and the particular expression that meant he had something to say. Ashmore reached for 1 glass. Tell me about her. Rupert sat in the chair across the desk and took his time. You want the file version or the honest one? The second one. The old man turned his glass slowly. Nadine Quill has worked for this organization for 5 years. In that time, she has flagged 14 accounting irregularities that your prior oversight team missed entirely. 3 of those would have created serious legal exposure had they reached the quarterly audit. She found all of them first. Ashmore was quiet. She has a degree in forensic accounting from the University of Chicago. Top of her class. The offers she had coming out of school were substantial. She turned them all down. Why? Her mother was sick. Rupert set down his glass. The kind of sick that doesn't get better. Nadine spent the first 2 years after graduation working 3 jobs to cover the costs. When her mother passed, there were still debts, medical ones, and what her mother had quietly borrowed from people who don't typically lend out of generosity. The lamp threw long shadows across the desk. The kind of people, Ashmore said, who would have taken other things in payment? The kind of people, Rupert agreed, who were persuaded approximately 4 years ago to forgive the remaining debt in exchange for other considerations. Nadine doesn't know who arranged it. But whoever was responsible, she has been paying it forward ever since. He paused. Last winter, 2 junior accountants made an error that would have cost them their positions. She stayed 3 consecutive nights correcting it and told the department head the mistake had been hers. The room was very quiet. They still work here, Rupert finished, both of them. They don't know why. Ashmore stood and walked to the window. Below, the city moved with its usual indifferent momentum. And tonight, he said. Tonight, she reconciled the chip count discrepancy from a terminal in the manager's office while someone was wrapping her hand. Rupert allowed himself a faint smile. Because she was worried, the data window would close. Silence. She was right about the window, Rupert added. By the way, the rumors began the following morning. Silvana did not rage. She never raged. It was one of her disciplines, and she wore it like a piece of jewelry. Instead, she moved through the hotel's breakfast gathering with her usual composure, pausing to speak quietly with this person and that one, her voice pitched low and her expression carefully sympathetic. She's not what she seems. A woman doesn't stay invisible in that job for 5 years if she's not getting something from it. You have to wonder who arranged for those debts to disappear. I've noticed how she positions herself near important conversations. By noon, the temperature in rooms Nadine walked into had dropped by several degrees. Conversations rerouted. Gazes slid away. One of the event coordinators, a quiet young man who had always been polite to her, caught her eye in the elevator and then looked very deliberately at the floor numbers. Nadine noticed. She always noticed. She had made a career out of seeing things that weren't meant to be seen. She could have explained herself. She had thought about it, standing in her office that morning, with her bandaged thumb and the corrected reports on her screen. She had weighed the cost of speaking against the cost of staying quiet, the way she weighed every number. In the end, she decided, truth was not a thing that needed defending every time someone told a different story about it. Truth existed whether or not anyone was paying attention to it. Her job was to keep being what she was and let the record speak when the time came. What she didn't know was that 40 feet down the hall, in a room with one-way glass and a full bank of security monitors, Corbett Ashmore was already watching the record. He had requested the footage that morning. Every camera in the event room for the full 12 hours prior to the poker night, plus the previous 2 months of staff common areas, the main floor, the back corridors. It took 4 hours to review what he needed. He watched Nadine work. He watched her catch a vase a catering assistant knocked from a shelf before it hit the floor, then hand it back with something that looked like a joke, because the assistant laughed. He watched her stay late on a Tuesday in November while everyone else went home, alone in the accounting bullpen at 11:45 p.m., frowning at a column of numbers until they gave up their secret. He watched her, twice, stand in the break room with a cup of coffee, going cold in her hand, while she talked someone off a ledge she had no stake in. And then he watched the poker night. He watched a young server carrying a tray of glassware. He watched Silvana walk directly into the tray. He watched the exact moment she looked at the server's face, then at Nadine's, and made a decision. He watched Nadine begin to reach for the broken glass before Silvana had even finished speaking. She hadn't calculated whether it was worth it, hadn't looked for a way out. She had simply moved to make things easier, the way she apparently did whenever something needed doing, and no one else was moving. Ashmore sat back from the monitors. He had spent 22 years building an empire out of a fundamental understanding of human nature. Most people, when pushed, revealed exactly what they were worth. He had made a great deal of money on the ones who cracked. He had also, occasionally, found the rare thing that didn't crack, and when he did, he knew what it was. He picked up the phone and called Rupert. Gather whoever is still here from last night. The event room, 45 minutes. Silvana walked in with the practiced confidence of a woman expecting to be told the evening was a minor misunderstanding and would now be resolved in her favor. She was still wearing the bracelet. The guests remaining from the previous evening, the senator, 2 investment partners, a magazine editor, and 3 others, had been assembled with no explanation given. Several looked uncertain. Silvana looked certain enough for the room. Ashmore stood at the front. A large screen had been set up behind him. He waited until everyone had settled. Last night, he said without preamble, an accusation was made in this room. And this morning, a different kind of accusation has been circulating. He looked at Silvana briefly. I have no interest in second-hand accounts. I deal in evidence. The screen came on. No music, no narration, just footage. The room watched a server carry a tray of glasses. The room watched Silvana walk into the tray. The room watched what happened after. The deliberate look, the deliberate choice, the command to kneel given to a woman who had done nothing except be standing in the wrong place when someone powerful needed a target. When the recording ended, no one spoke for several seconds. The magazine editor looked at the table. The senator rubbed his jaw. One of the investment partners, a man who had negotiated 9-figure deals across 3 continents, quietly examined his shoes. Silvana stepped forward. Her voice was steady. This is manipulation of context. The result was the same regardless of who. The result, Ashmore said, is on the screen. I am 4 months from becoming your wife. You are going to stand in front of these people and choose a bookkeeper. I'm not choosing between you. His voice did not rise. It didn't need to. I'm removing something that doesn't belong here. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the nearest table. A ring, not dramatically. The way you set down something you are finished carrying. You'll have your things out of the suite by morning. My attorney will be in touch tomorrow. He glanced at the 2 men standing near the door. Arrangements will be made for Miss Dare's departure tonight. Not in 3 days. Not when it was convenient tonight. Silvana stared at him. For the first time, the composure slipped enough to show what was underneath. Not grief exactly, but the genuine shock of someone who has never before miscalculated by this much. She looked around the room, the senator, the partners, the editor. Not one of them met her eyes. She left without speaking again. The room exhaled, slow and collective like a building settling after a long storm. 3 weeks later, Nadine was called to the 4th floor office. She arrived with a folder of quarterly reports under her arm, because she was Nadine, and she had learned to always come with something useful in her hands. Ashmore was standing at the window. She had noticed he did that, stood at windows the way other people stood at the edge of things they were thinking about. You wanted to see me. Sit down. She sat. He turned from the window and came to the desk, set a folder in front of her. She looked at the cover, opened it, read the first page, looked up. This is a director of finance position. Yes. For the Ashmore Group, the parent company. Yes. She looked back at the folder. Mr. Ashmore, I'm a bookkeeper. You're a forensic accountant who has spent 5 years doing the work of a department head without the title or the salary. He sat across from her. That was my oversight, not your limitation. She was quiet for a moment. Why now? He considered the question. Because I spent 20 years assuming that people who kept quiet did it out of fear. Then I watched someone stay quiet for an entirely different reason, and I realized I had been wrong about the whole calculation. Nadine looked at him. He held her gaze, without any of the things she was accustomed to seeing in people who looked at her too long, the brief appraisal, the mild recalibration of expectations. He simply looked, the way he looked at everything, completely. I'll need a week to think about it, she said. You have it. She stood. At the door, she paused. Something had been sitting in the back of her mind since the night of the poker event, and she had never quite found the right frame for it. 4 years ago, she said without turning around, my mother's debt. To people who don't typically forgive debts. She paused. That was you. Silence. You don't have to confirm it, she said. I'm not asking for that, I'm just. She found the word, saying thank you, to whoever was responsible. She heard him shift his weight, the small sound of a careful man making a small decision. She was going to lose more than money, he said, quiet, factual. It needed to be handled. Nadine stood with her hand on the doorframe. Why? Because some things need handling. A pause. And because 6 months after you started, the numbers you sent me had 3 catches in them that my entire finance team had missed for a year. I pay attention to things worth paying attention to. She almost smiled, almost. She left. She took the job. The first thing she did was restructure the variance reporting system to catch the low-level irregularities that had been bleeding out undetected for years. She did it in 2 weeks. The finance team, who had been braced for a new director with a clipboard and a list of their failures, found instead that she sat with each of them individually, learned what they knew, and built around their strengths rather than their gaps. They trusted her before she had been there a month. Not because she demanded it. Because she was already worth it by the time they thought to measure. Ashmore watched from a careful distance. He never crowded anything he respected, but he noticed things. He noticed the way the finance floor ran quieter when she was in it. The particular productive quiet of people who were not afraid of being wrong. He noticed that she still stayed late sometimes, still found reasons to be useful outside her job description, still acted as though the work mattered independently of anyone watching. He had known brilliant people before, ruthless ones. He had known people who were kind the way some people are polite, because it cost them nothing. He had not, until recently, known someone whose decency appeared to be entirely load-bearing. The thing her whole architecture was built on. One evening in late November, she was in her new office, a real one, with a door and a window, and her name on the glass, when he appeared in the doorway. She looked up. "Working late again," he observed. "Year-end rollover. The numbers don't care about the calendar." He came in and sat in the chair across from her desk with the ease of a man who had made himself comfortable in dangerous rooms all his life, and found this particular room notably less dangerous than most. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You always do anyway." She looked at him. "The morning after the poker night, the footage, you reviewed it the same day." "Yes. You already knew what happened before you gathered everyone in that room." "Yes." She was quiet. "You could have handled it privately. Sent her away, managed the information. You have people who do exactly that." "I do. Why didn't you?" He looked at her steadily. "Because you were in a room full of people who watched what happened to you and said nothing. And I wanted every one of them to have to look at it again. A beat. With the lights on." Something crossed her face. A fracture in the careful composure she had worn for years like a second skin. She had worked hard at keeping her expression from giving things away. She was not entirely successful this time. "Thank you," she said, quiet, straight. It wasn't generosity. He said it plainly, the way he said most things. "You conduct yourself with more integrity than anyone in this organization. I have a professional interest in making sure that's clearly understood." She almost challenged that, almost pointed out that professional interest didn't typically require gathering an audience and laying out evidence like a verdict. But she looked at him across the desk in the low light of her office, at the careful, absolute way he was looking back at her, and understood that they were both aware, at this point, that professional interest was only partially what they were talking about. What they were talking about. "I should get back to the rollover," she said. "You should." He stood. "Eat something first. You've been in here since 1. "I had coffee." "That's not what I said." He left. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on her desk. Then she smiled, small, private, the kind she had spent years giving herself only when no one was looking. A full year later, the Ashmore Grand held its annual charity night. The room was the same. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, the low hum of money being spent on things that mattered. The guests were different. Some were the same faces, but the room had a different quality now, something that hadn't been there the year before. People moved through it, without the particular carefulness of guests who were watching each other for signals about how to behave. Before the doors opened, Nadine stood at the edge of the ballroom floor, doing a final logistics check with the catering lead. She still did that, still showed up early, still knew the names of every person carrying a tray. Ashmore found her there. He came to stand beside her, not in front of her. Beside her, the way he had once done in a different room under worse circumstances. And she remembered it because she remembered everything. "Ready?" he said. She looked at the room, at the people who were about to fill it, at the distance between this night and that one. "Yeah," she said, "we're ready." He held out his arm. She looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then she took it. They walked in together. The guests noticed. They noticed the way he kept her beside him, the way he introduced her not as staff, but as the person who built this. The way she laughed at something a senator said and didn't shrink from the attention, didn't fold herself smaller than she was, didn't look for the nearest exit. She had, somewhere over the past 12 months, stopped trying to be invisible. Not because the world had gotten gentler, but because she had decided, finally, that she was worth being seen. Near the end of the evening, when the pledges had been announced and the music had lifted, and the room had settled into the comfortable warmth of a night going well, Ashmore leaned close enough to speak for her alone. "I looked into your mother's creditors again. Every one of them has been permanently persuaded to redirect their professional interests elsewhere." She turned to look at him. "That was years ago. You did that before you knew me." "I knew your work." A pause. "It was enough." She was quiet for a moment in the middle of the noise of the room. "Then, you know, for a man with your particular professional reputation, you're extraordinarily committed to making sure the right people don't suffer for the wrong reasons." He looked at her. Something moved in the grey of his eyes, quiet and deep. The thing that had always been there when he looked at her, that she had stopped pretending she didn't see. "Someone has to be," he said. The music played, the room held its warmth, and Nadine Quill, who had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible, stood in the middle of it all exactly where she was meant to be, seen whole and entirely unafraid.